Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of AP US History. I am Langella Sensei. So guys, welcome back with another video, and what we're going to do today is focusing on the Eisenhower years, and this is going to be section 2 of Unit 8, which is focusing on the Cold War era. And before we get started, I want to get us kind of in a refresher of last time, which is really focused on the Truman era. And we focused on, lastly, to kind of look at the legacy of Truman. And some things here that might kind of jog your memory, which basically was that when we look at early Truman policy, which was the idea of containment, how effective was this idea? We look at how whether or not the Korean War was it effective at containing communism, the idea of interactions with China, was it effective at containing communism? Not so much. And even other European nations, especially with the expansion of the Marshall Plan, which had talked about really giving a lot of money to these westernized nations to stop the spread of communism. And how effective was that policy, right? And a lot of people were analyzing this, especially when it comes to the beginning of the arms race, where our competition between us and USSR was getting hotter and hotter, and see who has the most stockpiling of nuclear weapons. And this is kind of jump-starting this tension between us and the USSR, and we'll kind of continue along with that concept. But we also have to analyze the Korean War. We saw how effective we were at kind of establishing our policy when it comes to it. We also saw the disintegration of civil rights, especially when it comes to the fear and paranoia that was leading to a lot of people questioning if someone was involved with the USSR spying of the United States. We saw a decrease in civil rights of specifically the First Amendment, the idea of free speech, depending on what a political affiliation you were. If you were for the Communist Party, then you definitely lost a lot of your rights, versus those that were not, which were kind of basically normal. Then we saw the reemergence of the Red Scare, the second Red Scare, under Joseph McCarthy, and we saw its impact on civil liberties because of the fact that he was targeting a lot of political opponents without any sort of evidence to back his claims. And then we kind of saw the disintegration of Joseph McCarthy. And then here we are. I mean, at the end of the day, with all this happening, we now see a shift in the political mindset of a lot of people of America. I mean, I asked you to kind of paint your own legacy of Truman, and how would you look at Truman as a president and how effective he was at doing some of the things he had put forward from the beginning of the first video we had mentioned a few days ago, or really just recently. But the reality is, with all this happening, we see a kind of a spark of political influence along the lines of Eisenhower and his Republican regime. Now, to understand really the mindset of the country at this time period, they start to put forward really two big, it's really the Republican point of view has a lot of bigger candidates versus the Democrats. All right, so Republicans have put forward Dwight Eisenhower, and alongside him was a very prominent figure at the time, Richard Nixon, who as his vice president. And Richard Nixon basically was, remember, he was going after a lot of those the people at the spy ring. I mean, he went after Alger Hiss, which eventually found to be nothing, but he was a prominent prosecutor in a lot of those cases. And then in the Democratic point of view, they have a Di Stevenson who went against McCarthy, which obviously a lot of people can associate with. But people have to understand that with Truman's era kind of coming to an end, and people started to look at Truman as whether or not he was successful or not in completing his policy of containment and the political divisions that were going on throughout his presidency, a lot of people were kind of leaning towards Eisenhower. And it was a very interesting race between the two candidates. I mean, specifically, when we look at Eisenhower, he did a very good job. He was kind of spreading the word pretty fast, and we're actually going to analyze one of his advertisements right in a second. But the point was, he had spread these very catchy ads that were kind of, his nickname was Ike, and you can see it right here. And the most interesting thing about it is that when he was a child, it was all his families, like his older brother and his family, even his dad's side, they always were called Ike at some point in life. Like he was called Young Ike, and his older brother was Big Ike. It's like a really family nickname. But he kind of ran with it. He used that nickname to kind of push a lot of his television ads. And I'm actually going to show you one right now to kind of get you in the mindset of how catchy this really was. And it's very interesting, just to say the least. So let's take a look at Eisenhower's ad for president. Just you can see the difference in ads back then versus today.
Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We don't want John or Harry, let's do that big job where we are going. Travel day and night for President. Adelaide go the other way. We'll all go with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike. Everybody likes Ike for President. Hang out the banner, beat the drum. We'll take Ike to Washington. We'll take Ike to Washington.
Now is the time for all good Americans to come to the aid of their country. Vote for Eisenhower.
So you can just kind of tell the effectiveness of that type of ad. It paints the other previous presidents as being failures, and then it points that we're kind of done with focusing on Democrats, and now we're going to shift back our policies to Republican and kind of use Eisenhower as that figure. And the most interesting thing is that Eisenhower was killing it on the campaign trail. And the funniest thing is that Richard Nixon, we all know how corrupt he becomes later on, but Richard Nixon almost blows it this whole campaign because of the fact that he was found using campaign funds for his own use, and he actually had to come forward and give a whole speech about how he'll never do this again and all this stuff because of the fact that he almost lost Eisenhower this election. But Eisenhower is so super popular with his mantra, his symbolism of being a hero, and then all these ads really just paint into that idea and really going on to the failures of Democratic presidents behind him because they're looking at Truman as being someone that had divided the country, and the whole McCarthyism kind of started underneath that, and it kind of expanded that ideal that under Truman and other Democratic presidents, they failed. So now it's time to transition out of the Democrat back into a Republican, and he wins by a landslide. I mean, 442 electoral votes. That's a big time victory. When you look at now the Eisenhower's Republicanism, modern Republicanism concept, you kind of have to understand that when you look at modern Republicans, it's the idea of cutting the federal budget, being a stickler of the money, right? Focusing on states' rights, increasing spending on Social Security, and raising the minimum wage. And these are two concepts that not necessarily are modern-day ideals of Republicans, but generally this was a shared belief of the modern-day individual that wants the increase of Social Security and minimum wage, so he kind of uses those concepts to kind of expand his ideas. But he did wanted to restrict the amount of money we're spending, because think of it this way: the Democratic presidents behind him, right, were using the New Deal, the Fair Deal, all these different types of deals that were funneling money from the federal government into programs. And Eisenhower wanted to cut that, and he also wanted to allow the states to kind of have more power and leeway over their own decisions. So this is kind of the emergence, like I said, of the modern day Republican Party. And he kind of, you can tell by just some of his policies. I mean, he does increase the department. I mean, he does create the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which does allow for a bureaucracy to kind of aid in expanding some of the influence over these things. But he does oppose some things that are, modern day Republican ideals, right? A cut in federal health care. They want to allow the states to handle their own health care and allow more private business to kind of take care of that stuff. And especially when it comes to federal aid to education, they want the states to really be the leaders going forward on how they want their own schools to go forward into education policy. Instead of it being a federal mandate, it's more of a state mandate, which is like the bottom line here. Modern day Republican concepts is right here, right? And you look at the quote, he says: conservative when it comes to money, liberal when it comes to human beings. That's as simple as it gets, right? Cut the federal budget, increase state rights. Now, along with this, and we kind of mentioned some of these things before. I mean, during this time period, we saw the baby boom occur. We saw a new expansion of infrastructure. I mean, under Eisenhower, we see Federal Interstate Highway Act, which basically has so much money invested into the road system, into highways, so that we can connect one part of the country to another, promoted mobility, uniformity, and changing lifestyles and how people lived. People now are migrating to all over the place, and we kind of mentioned this in the first part of the Unit 8, where people were now traveling from the Northeast and going into the Sun Belt areas because they wanted to kind of get away from the horrible weather and also the high taxes that they were facing. And this is kind of now, changing the way the society lives. But at the same time, we end up seeing kind of a growth of these defensive spending. Now, granted, the Republican ideal is to not spend a lot of money on these not infrastructure programs, but healthcare programs and other education style programs, but to invest the money more into creating jobs, into infrastructure, and also to increase the amount of money that is into the defense spending. So you can kind of see this in Eisenhower's years, where basically we see the emergence of the arms race really continuing. The space race ends up happening, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and also just in other ways of us investing more money into the military as years progress. And you can kind of see a comparison here under, as the Republican presidents start to continue more spending into military. And then some other things that we start to notice too, and this is kind of helping the general American, specifically the veterans. The GI Bill and the National Defense Education Act basically try to create a wave of mass education, try to basically have more people educated than before, specifically a lot of former veterans to go basically back to college to gain an education, gain a trade so they can join the workforce. And this is now basically jumpstarting the economy. Basically having more people have more learning new skills allows for the economy to grow more than ever before. And now we start to see an emergence of the middle class and working class become more educated, going back to college. And we see, this is the number of people that were in the workplace and in education more than ever before. Because Eisenhower and others believe that having an education, joining the workforce, was the engine of democracy. Having this spark of expansion of the economy will help protect democracy from being overturned into communism. Basically, creating capitalistic ideals into this educational system definitely will protect itself from the rise of communism. But at the same time that all this is happening, we see a expansion of popular culture and basically new consumer goods, new ways of expanding culture. We kind of mentioned and some of this even during like the Harlem Renaissance and the Progressive era. But now we're going to see even a bigger popular culture expansion nowadays, because we see new innovations, new technologies are now being developed. And when it comes to computers, new types of TVs and advertising, new types of books and record players, electric kitchens, new types of gadgets in the kitchen itself, automobiles, new types of cars. They have garages now. They have you should have more cars so you can put them in your garage. TV dinners, fast food, air conditioning, credit cards, all that stuff and more go into really the consumer mass culture production that ends up happening. But let's first talk about television and the radio, because those are the two most important, I think, in my eyes. When television is now going to be created. I mean, there was already film, and there was already radio, and there was already music. But now in the standard television, where there start to be national broadcast channels start to emerge, basically the TV impacts society in such a big way that we can't even imagine it. I mean, just imagine without TV. As much people might not like watching television all the time, but a lot of people do. And at the time, by 1961, a television set was for every 3.3 American families. I mean, that's a lot of TVs being out there. And this is during a time where there weren't really a lot of national broadcast networks. But basically, these broadcast networks would show, sitcoms, different types of comedies, westerns, quiz shows, and even professional sports. And probably the two biggest ones that you can kind of look at, like Leave It to Beaver was one of the biggest TV programs. I Love Lucy becomes huge. I mean, so many people look at these comedies as being, so impactful and really showing popular culture. But to understand the impact of television, radio on society, it really was a way for people to expand how the ideal family is supposed to be, right? That's the biggest thing you need to understand. As much as, learning about the broadcast networks and some of the TV shows and stuff like that was important, really television and radio had tried to give people a sense of what family roles should be like. What is the ideal family in America supposed to look like? And they tried to expand on how women's roles were supposed to be, how men were supposed to act, how children were supposed to act, all obedient, and all these different things. And basically, this was trying to promote the way a family should be. And on top of that, with all this happening, these types of program networks, advertising now is expanding and leads to another way of gaining more capitalistic ideals, right? Advertising basically trying to promote people to buy more products than ever before, and that there are so many products out there that basically they create the idea of a credit card, basically be able to have a card where you can, it's almost like you're constantly having a loan where you can buy something on credit and then pay it off a little bit later on, and people ran with it. People love the concept of doing so they can buy more products and just pay the bill later on so that they can worry about paying that off in a month. You know what I mean? So it allowed for people to kind of buy more goods. Along with the television and radio, we see an expansion of music. We see the emergence of rock and roll. I mean, rock and roll is such a big deal because now we already saw how jazz had impacted the Harlem Renaissance. We already saw how poetry and all these different mindsets started to expand the ideas of how culture of different individuals was. But rock and roll was now being spread to the younger generation. A lot of older people didn't really like it. They thought the music stunk. But that's kind of like how it is nowadays too. But the reality is, rock and roll really jumpstarts this new era of young defiance, and we see a lot of rock and roll was originated through the black community, through with Chuck Berry, and this is kind of a mixture of blues and other types of art forms. But it becomes really, really popular with the emergence of Elvis Presley, and because of the fact that he was a young individual, he kind of attached himself to the younger generation, allowed for people to kind of associate with Elvis Presley, even though at the end of the day, this was already started in the black community way before Elvis Presley. But along with this kind of mass culture expansion, we see a group of people that are, it's known as the social critics, and I'll kind of explain all this. Let me just get all this out of the way. Basically, these social critics were people that were kind of out of the norm. What they wanted to do was try to be almost like the rebel. They wanted to it was a wave of books, different types of literature, poems that were going against the social norms of society. You know, when you look at rock and roll, you look at TV, you look at radio, a lot of the times they try to paint how roles of society should be, how the average family should live. And the people that were part of the beatniks or the other groups that were kind of seen as the outcasts, they wanted to kind of go against this social norm that the general public was looking as how you should act. And a lot of these different pieces of literature were basically targeting that type of concept. And when you look at, Catcher in the Rye was one of the famous literature books of the time period. And basically, I'm sure you read Catcher in the Rye, basically is about a young rebellious teenager that kind of paints a lot of people as phonies, as being, fake. And he tries to kind of, when you look at the story itself, it's a symbolism of saying be against the social norm, and that's kind of the big thing to understand. Is that a lot of these books here, the beatniks group themselves are basically trying to say we should try to go against the social norms, and this is actually the jumping point of the youth movement of the '60s. The kind of let's go against what everyone is telling us we should act like and be our own individuals. And these social critics are going to be really, really important as we progress into the next era. And at the same time, we see a counteract of this changing roles of women. I mean, a lot of people, especially when it comes to mass culture, we see in the televisions, the radios, they paint women as being a stay-at-home parent, taking care of the children, homemakers, all that stuff. But at the end of the day, women's roles are changing already. I mean, the fact is 35% of women were in the workplace at this point. Married women, women in middle class were working more than ever. There were more women who were attending colleges. So this concept of women basically staying at home and taking care of the kids was a bunch of bull. I mean, at the end of the day, women were kind of doing more than they ever were. And this mass culture was trying to kind of keep women staying at home, but that wasn't necessarily the case. And just to shine light on here, I did find this meme that was kind of funny. So, you look at advertisements and things like that, they were always, dramatizing women as being in the home, but that wasn't necessarily happening. And like I said, the whole social critics concept was basically going against the social norms of the time. To say, hey, listen, as much as you want people to stay, doing a specific thing in their life, not everyone was following that. And they were kind of being their own person. And that's kind of the important thing you have to understand about this movement. All right, well, that's going to be it for us today. We're going to focus on Eisenhower and the Cold War the next time we meet. But like I said, guys, focus on answering the questions. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'm always here to help. That's it for me. Langella out.